Welcome to all our listeners in Republican Institute podcast. We have a very special edition today, a really unique opportunity to have Pat Cox with us today, former President of the European Parliament. And we are going to speak on the occasion of Hungary's 20th anniversary of joining the European Union. Pat, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, it's my great pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
It's an absolutely fantastic and great opportunity to speak on this great anniversary, which is really a significant historical point in Hungary's modern day history. I believe that it's quite a shame that we haven't really seen much celebrations around the country to commemorate this really significant event in the country's life and the life of everyday Hungarians as well, not only at the state level but at the level of every single citizen. First, probably I can share this little piece of information that we actually met in person last week when you visited CEU, and you were part of the Irish Embassy's Irish Speaker Series at the university. And you spoke about your experience with the EU accession of the 10 countries that joined the Union in 2004, when you were President of the European Parliament, and actually at that time when Ireland had the presidency of the EU. So actually, my first question to you would be, returning to Budapest. How was it to you? What changes you saw in Budapest compared to your first experiences, which were before Hungary joined the EU in 2004?
Well, I have been, of course, to Budapest very many times, politically starting back in the early 1990s and right through until the end of my mandate in 2004. I've been back in Budapest and in Hungary different times as a tourist and a visitor. And I was very pleased to be back at the invitation of the Irish ambassador to Hungary to mark the 20th anniversary of the Big Bang enlargement. So I suppose in terms of first impressions, if you ask me, like some earlier visits that I've made in the past to Hungary, I thought it an unhappy sight to see the vast number of anti-European posters plastered along so many billboards on the main road from the airport to the city centre. I thought it disappointing but not surprising to see the paucity of European flags flying on public buildings. And I thought it was disappointing, but it's a matter for the Hungarian authorities themselves, that the state did not appear to take any time out to mark the occasion. If I bring you back in terms of my memories of 20 years ago, what happened, of course, on the 1st of May and in Strasbourg on the 3rd of May, when we welcomed all the new parliamentarians and the speakers of the national parliaments to the European Parliament, these were really very moving, very positive, I would say quite emotional events. The event in Ireland was in the Phoenix Park. It was hosted by the Irish presidency, the then Irish presidency of the European Union. All of the new states and the existing member states at that time attended. Our great poet and Nobel laureate for literature, Seamus Heaney, read a poem specially commissioned by the Irish government called Beacons at Bealtaine. Bealtaine is that time of the Irish year when people lit fires as beacons welcoming the whole summer season. And I think he captured the underlying optimism of that time. There are many lines I could pick, but one line from his poem, he said that the historic enlargement could move lips, move minds, and make new meanings flare. And a few days later in Strasbourg, the 10 national flags of the new member states were raised on flagpoles that had been made in the shipyards in Gdansk, a gift from the nation of Poland, who traveled from the shipyard to Strasbourg symbolically as the journey from communism to freedom. And I was accompanied for that short outdoor ceremony by Lech Walesa, who personified the face of the Solidarność movement in the shipyards when they never knew, would they live or die? Would they be free or would they be in prison? And so it was really powerful and emotional. And for me, it was a homecoming. It was an act of reunification. It was a Europe of free peoples choosing for themselves, not having choices imposed upon them. And it was a fulfillment of a phrase used by Pope John Paul II, who talked about Europe breathing on her two lungs, East and West. And I felt as an Irish European, a powerful sense of emotion, which I can still some way even feel today, 20 years later, that this first breath on these two lungs officially was drawn at an event in the capital city here in Dublin, where I live. And why was it worth celebrating? If I stand back and zoom up a little bit from that very emotional sense that I have of that moment, I think all the enlargements of the European Union have been powerfully transformative and have represented for the states that joined and for the Union itself, or the EEC as it was when Ireland joined, it represented a win-win situation. Ireland joined the EEC 51 years ago as the poorest region of the then European Economic Community. And over time, and not all a smooth transition, and with ups and downs, these are always there, we have emerged as one of the wealthiest, healthiest, best educated communities in the Union. Do we still have issues and problems? Of course we do. That's in the nature of life and politics. But it has been enormously transformational and positive. If I look at the enlargements of the 80s, Greece, Spain and Portugal, we underpinned the re-emerging democracies after totalitarianism or fascism in some of those states. And this has been a win-win. And if I look at the enlargement of 20 years ago, it has produced really some quite extraordinary and positive results. If we look at it, there has been spectacular growth. The whole region in Central Eastern Europe has benefited from a surge in investment, in trade, in spending, in European solidarity funding, which has been a huge bonus. The income per head across the region 20 years ago was under 50% of the EU average, and in some cases even much below that. And on average now, in spite of the EU continuing to grow as well, if you compare adjusting for currency and inflation in real terms, the income per head across the region is 3/4 of the EU average, taking the region as a whole. And in the case of Lithuania, in fact, the income has trebled, which is really quite an extraordinary transformation from where we started 20 years ago. And it's not just about income. Health services have improved. Infant mortality rates have declined. Longevity, people are living longer. The overall investment in education and so on has gone up. The quality of the infrastructure is unrecognizable. All of these things are not just about money, they're about the quality of life. And so to me, this has been a huge win for the states that were candidates 30 and 25 years ago who became members, and a win for the EU. And so I'm a kind of an enlargement optimist. Now, I'm not going to sweep under the carpet. There's a load of other issues I'm sure we'll come to. But overall, I think the most powerful transformational policy instrument in the EU's toolkit of policies has been enlargement. And it has been for 5 decades consistently a winning formula for those who acceded and for those who opened up to that accession.
That I really, really appreciate your enlargement optimism. I think it's a fantastic approach to the European Union and to the values the EU represents. But my question is, I know you think of all the 10 accession states of 2004 with the equal optimism, and especially in 2004, probably you had your personal preferences, but which please do not tell about. But that is just quite human to like one country more than another. But actually, I'm really curious how the picture, what you see and what you believe your fellow Irish citizens and your fellow European politicians see of Hungary has changed over the last 20 years. And I know it's not fair from me to only focus down on Hungary, but as a Hungarian and talking for a Hungarian audience, I think probably the most relevant question is not how the respect or the expectations towards Lithuania or Slovakia have changed, but how Hungary's position has changed in the European eye over the last 20 years.
Well, I mean, look, I can't speak for the people of Ireland, and I don't have a mandate in the European Parliament anymore to speak for the European Parliament. But I'm perfectly happy.
This is what I'm looking for is only an opinion poll on a sample of one.
Sure. So I am perfectly happy to speak for myself. The short form of what I think is going to be, for me, a longer answer is that I have been personally disappointed to see the direction that Hungary has chosen to travel, the more especially as the concentration of political power in the hands of one party, and really, I guess, from the longevity he's had in the leadership and hands of one person, in the person of the Prime Minister, Mr. Orban, I think has been a step backwards from the Europe of values that I believe in, and from the values which were clearly, explicitly stated in the accession treaty, which was signed by Hungary in April of 2003 in Athens in Greece. So the EU offered a clear prospectus. It wasn't a hidden agenda. There were no elements in it that were not known. And when states signed up to that prospectus, they knew what they were signing up to. So I want to, if I could, against that kind of introduction, run through a variety of things that, to me, I think count, particularly about Hungary. There clearly now is, in the mind of Mr. Orban, a battle of wills about shaping the future of Europe. And I think that battle of wills is nowhere more pronounced than it is in Hungary today. When I read Mr. Orban's speech, for example, on National Day recently, he was making assertions about the European Union wanting to bring Hungary into a war, about the European Union trying some way, I think, to corrupt your youth through various kind of indoctrination policies and so on. It's not the European Union I know, and it's not the European Union we live in. It is a European Union of imagination, of presentation, of polemics. But it's not the real Europe, but it is the one Europe of the polemics of Mr. Orban. He talks about his illiberal democracy. I don't think the European Union or its treaties are founded or believe in such a concept. He asserts patriotic nationalism over global elites. But inside the European Union, we are a union of voluntary states, and the joining, or as Brexit unhappily proved, the leaving, is a matter of voluntary will and sovereign choice. And if Mr. Orban believes that being in the European Union profoundly offends the Hungarian identity and national interest, he's entitled to leave if he wishes. But of course, he doesn't wish to leave. He wishes to complain from the inside, but to remain on the inside. He's willing to transgress fundamental mutual rules, whether it's about justice or media freedom or the role of civil society, the rights of minorities. But while he transgresses those mutual rules, he demands that other states and that the Union should offer its mutual solidarity on an unconditional basis.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So many questions pop to my head while you speak. Actually, there's one that I just have to ask you. It's about, you mentioned Prime Minister Orban's speech at Hungary's National Day in March. And actually, I was really, really interested to hear how you experience other European member states, or the leaders of other European member states, or just at least the political representatives of other EU member states refer to the EU, like now just simply at the level of communications. Because in Hungary, that's so common to refer to the EU as them, and then there is us against them. And these are like two completely separate entities. And I believe that for many Hungarians, not the realization, I mean, at the level of conscious knowing, of course, they are aware of Hungary's EU membership, but at probably one or two levels deeper, at an emotional level of understanding what the membership means, I think it's really not present, because still in communication, it appears that there is them, the EU, and then against them, there is Hungary.
Well, this is all a form of, I don't know what I can call it. It's a kind of performative politics practiced by many populists who demonize Brussels, who other Brussels. The othering of Brussels is a fundamental part of the populist polemic everywhere. And it presents Brussels almost as some alien external force, as distinct from a voluntary community of states who've agreed under the treaties to pool part of their sovereignty in order to develop and improve their collective interests and promote their collective values. In the case of Hungary, of course, when we can add in the communication strategy, which you can find most interestingly, I think, by where do you want to shake a hand, or which photo opportunity do you want to privilege? Am I surprised to see that during a war of aggression against Ukraine that offends the fundamental charter of the United Nations, that Mr. Orban is happy to smile beside Vladimir Putin, the aggressor, in a chosen war, when he visits Beijing? Am I surprised to see that on the 9th of May, Europe Day, Mr. Orban is not playing the Ode to Joy, regarded as the EU anthem, or flying the European flag? Instead, he has an ode of praise to Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping, I'm sure it's not by accident, found himself in Budapest on Europe Day. And he announced in Budapest, outside perhaps his relationship, his no limits friendship with Russia, perhaps the most comprehensive strategic partnership of any other state, certainly of any European Union state, that is there. He described his relationship with Viktor Orban as being the best it's ever been in our history, and talks about a comprehensive strategic partnership. This would place in what I might call the Beijing Olympics of engagement, Mr. Putin winning the gold medal in those Olympics, and Mr. Orban coming just slightly behind in winning the silver medal of Olympian Beijing approval. And I see all of this almost in a way, it's a very intelligent strategy by President Xi Jinping, as seeking to instrumentalize Hungary as a European Trojan horse. And I think Europe needs to have an acute sensitivity to what the consequences of that instrumentalization could be over time.
Well, actually, before we go on with our conversation, I think that it would be very important to spend a couple of minutes on elaborating a little on what we mean by European values or EU values, because this is practically in the very core of what we are talking about the values that all EU member states respect and the values that Hungary and the rest of the 10 accession states of 2004 signed up for. But actually, this is exactly what we have seen questioned so many times recently when the Hungarian government and government officials were involved in the debates around rule of law and how our rule of law is being demolished in Hungary, or what dangers are there for the rule of law. A very common answer to that from government circles was that, well, actually nobody has a perfect definition for rule of law. No, we don't know exactly what rule of law is. It's debatable, and we should discuss that, which suggests that there is an attempt to completely rethink or rewrite those fundamental values the EU is based on. So I'm really curious how you see that attempt from certain government side. I don't want to narrow this down to the Hungarian government, because there can easily be other EU member states government that once find themselves in similar positions. So I think this is certainly not necessarily a national characteristic. And how do you see, or what do you see to be those EU values that are worthy of being protected?
Well, basically, before anyone joined the EU, we had a very long period of preparation, the pre-accession process, and this includes the Copenhagen criteria, and it requires a functioning democracy, a functioning market economy, the capacity to adopt and implement the EU acquis communautaire. We have in our treaties Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union, which sets out democracy, rule of law, pluralism, equality, and so on. All of these are very fundamental values. And of course, we have different backgrounds and traditions, and there are margins of interpretation as to what those things may be. But there are also boundaries that establish what they are not. And I think it's extremely important when we look at this, if we were going through the different criteria, to underline again that these were fully known in advance and were fully agreed to and were part of the contract of expectations for Hungary and for other states. And so the reason why the European Parliament in particular reacted in the way it did to the evolution of some events in your neighbor Poland, but especially also to the events in Hungary around judiciary and other issues and media, and why they said, we need some kind of a sanction, and they started to slow down the flow of money, was to say these behaviors are outside the boundaries of the acceptable in interpreting whatever the margin of maneuver is on fundamental rights and fundamental values. And
well, sorry, but I think my understanding is that the very point of the debate is whether these lines beyond which it's considered to be not okay, which is beyond which is considered to be not respecting the rule of law, for instance, whether that line is arbitrarily set. So are these debates about what rule of law exactly mean legitimate? Or is there any real legally binding definition that could actually apply to all EU member states, where one can say that, okay, there is no room for debate, these are the rules, you should abide by them?
Well, I think you would have to do an awful lot of reading if you're to read all of the European treaties. But I know one thing you will not find is a reference to a concept called illiberal democracy. And so for those who espouse illiberal democracy, they are choosing to differentiate themselves from liberal democracy. And liberal democracy is the opposite in terms of the direction of travel of illiberal democracy, which is on the spectrum heading towards autocracy. And so in the spectrum between what is liberal democracy within tolerable definitional limits and what is illiberal democracy, these belong to two separate universes. If it was mathematics, I don't see them being a Venn diagram with significant overlaps. They belong to two different circles of thought, and the circle of thought that constitutes a liberal democracy and that seeks to promote it and develop it in particular ways is an act of self-differentiation. So even if you argue that there is a definitional grayness about what precisely does a given treaty term mean, of course it can be subject to jurisprudence and interpretation before the Court of Justice of the European Union. But even if you argue that there's a margin of interpretation, when you shift a gear to say, well, we are an illiberal democracy, you've moved house. You've brought your sense of self-definition to a different place. And if you've done that, you've moved to a place that is outside any reasonable interpretation of the words contained in the foundational treaties and in foundational values.
It's really tough to move on because what you're saying, I think, is really, really important, but I feel that there is so big a gap between your understanding of European values and what the EU means at the level of values and shared understandings of how things should be, how we should live together, and the general understanding of the Hungarian people, the average Hungarian people who live their daily lives and don't really think about the EU, or when they think about the EU, they don't really think about the EU from that perspective. And what I'm basing my statement on is that contrary to all the EU critical and EU skeptic rhetoric of the government, which has been going on for 14 consecutive years now, basically, well, it has strengthened significantly over the years, but the general approach hasn't changed much. It merely strengthened. Still, the vast majority of Hungarians, fortunately, are very much pro-EU. And if there were a referendum this weekend about whether Hungary should join the EU or not, the yeses would win by an overwhelming majority. However, when it comes to people's opinion on why it is worth being a member of the EU, the first two things that come up are financial benefits, like the EU gives us money. That's what we can base our economic growth on. That helps us build buildings, whatever, invest all sorts of investments. And the second is free movement within the EU, which has been really, really crucial for many Hungarians, and that actually talks to the personal experience of many Hungarians who either themselves or their family members have already worked, studied abroad, somewhere in Western Europe, or actually they just enjoy the benefits of being able to go on holiday with a simple ID card without any further ado. So actually, my question is to you: is there any way you can see how more than that very simple material understanding of the EU can be brought closer to the average citizen?
I would say through the dense fog of government-led propaganda in Hungary, that reaching the citizen with other messages on Europe would be extremely difficult, because that fog has sat on the land and become more dense over the past 14 years. I don't wish to draw an equivalence, but I mean, a thought comes to my mind about surveys I would see about Russians' support for Mr. Putin's policy in Ukraine. When you control media and when you control messaging, and when you do it with such singular determination, and when you diminish the capacity for pluralist self-expression through key media and messaging, of course you create this dense fog that covers the public imagination. People in Hungary are completely correct to be happy about the material benefits of membership of the European Union. They are completely correct to enjoy their rights as EU citizens because they are citizens of a member state, to have passport-free travel within the Union, and to have rights within the Union as individuals. But they misunderstand the very idea of what Europe is about post-Second World War if their only presumption is that it was invented to give a check in the post and to allow people to travel more easily. The fundamental reasons why the European process started after the Second World War was to try to engage in an act of profound reconciliation on a continent whose, and I will use a phrase that is inaccurate, but it covers a lot, whose warring tribes and empires never ceased fighting forever. We lived in a densely populated, highly contested space where at some point nearly everyone invaded everyone else somewhere along the line, and where a notion of having a long period of stability, then with prosperity and material gain, but based on a fundament of stability and reconciliation and shared values that made war unthinkable among those who subscribed to those values and who agreed to the terms of reference of the foundational documents. This has been within the states who signed it. I go back to the original states, including France and Germany. Why were they so important to this? Because among the different states who joined, France and Germany, for the 100 years before, and many times before that, had been at war with each other. And here we found a platform for mutual respect, for solidarity, for a sense of building a common destiny, even though we had different national identities. And so all of these other issues that came into the debate around the expression of values, and these, of course, as you recall, all emerged in a very clear way after the nihilism of the Second World War and the shock and the various collapses that followed the First World War. So we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We got the European Convention on Human Rights. It's no accident that this period, this ferment of activity about rights, about individual rights, about minority rights, about fundamental democratic values, about respect for pluralist democracy, about open access for media. Why did they all happen then? Because these were the counterpart to the nihilism that had brought to us two world wars, starting in Europe, not ending in Europe alone, but starting in Europe. And the answer was to understand that you had to go back to something more basic, more fundamental, more values-based as the counterpart to nihilism that had destroyed the continent twice in the lifetimes of people who lived in the first half of Europe's 20th century. And what happened, of course, for Hungary and neighboring states was when the war finished, when this deal was done at Yalta about spheres of influence, Hungarians really had no choice. Joseph Stalin made their choice. And Hungary was part of the Soviet bloc, not fully part of the Soviet Union like Ukraine or the Baltic states, but part of the Soviet bloc. And Hungarians, of course, revealed a sense of their continuing identity in 1956. But that was crushed. And many very brave Hungarians paid a heavy price. And others, of course, fled as refugees. And it took until the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the implosion of the Soviet Union to release to states like Hungary and others the right of self-determination to join the European Union if they chose by sovereign will to do so, and to seek to join NATO. So of course I understand people wanted NATO for Pax Americana and security guarantees, and people wanted the EU for prosperity. But if they came with only a materialistic view, they miss the very foundations upon which material prosperity is grounded, founded, and develops, which is a values-based community of common interests and shared values. And so these have never been, from a European Union point of view, marginal add-on extras or other little decorations on an otherwise prosperity named Christmas tree. These are not decorations on a Christmas tree. These are the tree. These are the foundations. These are the roots. And these are the points of intersection. And for any country within that union to self-declare itself as an illiberal democracy is choosing, as I said, to remove it from the Venn diagram of overlapping legacies of EU and Hungary into two separate circles. The illiberal democracy concept is outside the fundamentals in value terms of the European Union. So you said, and I would be pleased to hear it, if there was a referendum tomorrow morning, the vast majority of Hungarian people would vote to join the EU. And that is good to hear. But can I tell you, if there had to be a choice tomorrow morning for the rest of the European Union to accept an acceding Hungarian state that had pre-declared itself to be an illiberal democracy, that opened itself to be a Trojan horse for external instrumentalization inside the Union, I think the Union might say no, thank you very much, but not right now and not on those conditions.
Well, that's a very powerful thought, and actually that's the thought experiment. I think that we play along with much less often than with the other one. Like, it seems to be clear that Hungarians would like to join the EU, but it's a completely different question whether the rest of the EU would like us to join in our current state. But I'm saying us, I mean the Hungarian state and not Hungarian citizens. And this
I understand. And I've always myself sought to draw a distinction between the two. And whatever views I have, and you can understand I expressed them with some clarity, whether they would be accepted or not by the powers that be in Budapest. But they are passionate views that I hold, but they are not views that are anti-Hungarian, which is precisely why I was so pleased recently to make a visit to Budapest at the invitation of the Irish Embassy. I was so pleased to speak at the Central European University, now robbed of its wonderful, loud, noisy students that I met there so often in the past, but still in business and still a symbol saying that we are here and we intend to stay here. And to me, the importance of the visit, as I hold out no presumption about it having any importance to do with Hungary, but for myself, it was an opportunity to express the values I believe in, to share the opinions that I have, and to embrace those that I met from Hungary who were willing to receive me and to talk as you're doing now, because talking to each other, creating positive dialogue, and being honest with each other matters if you want to develop a sound, sustainable, mutually respectful, long-term relationship.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I think why it was really important that you brought up this question of whether the EU would welcome Hungary in its current state or not, and why I believe that it was really good for the rest of our conversation was that I actually was planning to zoom out a little from Hungary, yes, because I'm really curious of your opinion about potential future accessions and potential future enlargement of the EU. Because we heard from several representatives of Western Balkan states, not only at the political level, but also at the citizens level. There's quite a lot of concern about the too long period of waiting for accession. And these countries very often, but again, now I have to correct myself, not the countries, not a state, but very often the citizens of these states feel a bit abandoned by the EU. They feel that while the accession negotiations and talks about their potential future within the EU are on the way, but have been on the way for many years. At the same time, the Commission President, for instance, makes gestures towards leaders in like Vučić in Serbia, and the potential accession states of the Western Balkans feel quite left behind very often. And I'm also really curious about your opinion whether Ukraine has a near future as an EU member state, because of course it has a symbolic political significance that the EU made a gesture towards Kiev by letting them one step closer. But actually the big question is how many more steps Ukraine still has to take, and where is the end of that road?
Well, that's a really big topic. So let's try to kind of slice and dice it a little bit to work through it. Firstly, as I said to you right at the beginning, my overwhelming sense of the enlargement instrument as a tool of EU policy is that it has been powerfully positive and transformative. And we know that by looking backwards. And in that sense, as I described to you, I'm an enlargement optimist. However, the process of enlargement is very complicated. So let's stand back first of all and look at process. I know we can go on to more depth. In process terms, to become a candidate state, you need the unanimous support of every existing member state. And you hope in that process that you will have from the member states something which is in Article 4, Paragraph 3 of the treaty, which is a duty of sincere cooperation. If I start with Hungary and the Prime Minister's games around the Ukrainian candidate status and leveraging that, of course, to try to release funds for Hungary, which, you know, is politically explicable some way. We do need the states to engage in sincere cooperation. If different member states game the system to bring in their favorites, but to leave out their least favorite, that can be a difficulty for enlargement, which is not to do with the EU. I want to come back to that, but was to do with member states. And we already got a signal with the attitudes of Mr. Orban to Ukraine that there may be difficulties which are not related to the EU's desires in the collective, but to this issue of sincere cooperation and engagement by individual states. Time will tell. The issue, you need unanimity to be candidate. You need unanimity at the General Affairs Council to have a framework for negotiations. This has to happen yet for all of the states recently added, like Ukraine, Moldova, etc. You then need unanimity to open a chapter of negotiations. And if I remember correctly, I think there are 35 of those. And then you need unanimity to close a chapter. And then you put it all together in a thing called an accession treaty. And then you need unanimity for that. And that then has to be ratified by every member state national parliament. It has to be ratified by the European Parliament. And it has to be ratified by the acceding states' parliaments. So, point number one, if someone wants to put his foot out and trip you up, there are lots of feet under the table and lots of opportunities to slow things down. So I'm not here I'm not a counselor of negativity on this. I'm simply observing the reality that this is a complicated space. That's procedure. Right now, what's happening is the Commission officials with national officials are doing what they call screening exercises. This is a procedure that happens even before you open negotiations of chapters. Could that be fast-tracked and speeded up? You know, possibly yes. But even if you're speeding it up, it's not that fast because it's very complicated and it has all the other complications I just mentioned. The second dimension in this enlargement process, stepping back again, is that the European Union has to prepare itself to absorb new members. So one is for the new members to absorb the European Union requirements. Not easy, but it has been done successfully in the past. And the other is for the EU to absorb the new members. Not easy, but it has been done successfully in the past. I think the two biggest challenges for the EU in absorbing all these potential new members comes to two things. One, how do you maintain an efficient capacity to make common EU decisions if you have larger numbers of member states at a table with more diverse potential interests at the table, but lots of powers of veto and unanimity voting at the table? That's a serious issue. And the serious issue is not about robbing states of a say or a fallback on critically important questions, but it's about avoiding gridlock. A system that became gridlocked through an inability to decide would actually damage the entire system, both for those inside today and for those hoping to exceed tomorrow. And the second big issue, and always a complicated issue in Europe, is the question of a budgetary capacity, the ability to pay for the reasonable expectations that new states will have pre-accession, for pre-accession economic solidarity, and post-accession for the full implementation of EU programs. So let me take, you mentioned Ukraine. I would say without any doubt, Ukraine is unique and uniquely the most complicated of the enlargement cases in the Union. That is so, of course, because today, unhappily, not by its own doing, Ukraine finds itself in a state of war, has a contact line with the Russians running for more than 1,000 kilometers of territory, is daily being bombed, not just on the contact line, but right across Ukraine in terms of damaging critical infrastructure. And for a country in a state of war, I think it is reasonable to suppose that the substantive prospect of enlargement will await the moment of peace. Now, what that peace will be territorially, in terms of justice, in terms of stability, all these things matter. But to bring a state in, you have to have its sovereign boundaries clear, and you have to have its negotiating capacity decided, and you have to have the stability conditions that you wish to be in place. So this is going to be uniquely challenging for Ukraine and for the EU. I'm not negative about this because I think most member states appreciate the historical uniqueness of the Ukrainian case, but it is also historically the most complicated. If I move down to the second tier, assuming we have a stable peace and assuming we have an agreed post-war territorial settlement, we know what Ukraine wants, which is the 1991 borders, and let me assume, for the sake of our argument, that is the result. Such a state, in the 1991 borders, would be the largest single state territorially ever to join the EU. So it's the biggest. Secondly, if you look at agriculture's share of gross domestic product, of output in Ukraine, it's relatively much larger than the EU average. So it is much more agricultural. Thirdly, if you look at the income per head in Ukraine, it is radically lower than the average income per head in the EU, including in the 10 states of the Big Bang enlargement of 20 years ago. So it is the poorest. So to take just those three things, and there are many other things. So assuming we've settled the war and peace and territory dimension, and that the reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be a multilateral funding exercise that isn't just off the back of an EU budget, we then have the biggest, most agricultural, poorest state ever to join. If you look at EU spending, it spends a lot on the common agricultural policy, and it spends a lot on cohesion and regional funding, the two biggest spending pillars. Ukraine would be entitled under the existing rules to very large shares of the agricultural spending and the cohesion spending. And of course, the states who now benefit from both of those spends will be saying, well, we could support this, but our farmers shouldn't have to pay. And, our poorer regions shouldn't have to pay. And so the pressures here are to create more EU financial capacity to be able to sustain and absorb. And I've just taken Ukraine as the example, but that's also because it's big and it's complicated. And, I remain underlying an enlargement optimist, but I'm not naive. So, we've got the learned experience now of enlargements. The second thing, to go to your question on Western Balkans, I think 2 decades ago, we dropped the ball in the Western Balkans. And unhappily, by dropping the ball, we opened up some space for Moscow and Beijing to play some more in that space, which in fact will complicate the whole process of engagement and enlargement. And I think in the case of Serbia, will make it especially complex as we look to lessons from the past and develop perspectives about the future. I think also the EU, after the Big Bang enlargement and then the entry of Romania and Bulgaria, and of course much more recently of Croatia, I think the EU went through a long period where it began to suffer from what I would describe as enlargement fatigue. But I think geopolitics has brought enlargement right up again. And enlargement is now one of the serious front-end policies that the EU cannot ignore and needs to address. So I don't think it's going to be simple. I don't think we should suppose one big bang. I think the different candidate states will have to make their own running at their own speed. And although, to go to your question, their populations may feel fed up and, why do we have to keep waiting? Joining the EU is not joining the local football club, where you come down and sign up and pay a small fee and you can get out and train with the B team in the hopes of making it to the A team. It doesn't work that way. The complexity I described, the Copenhagen criteria I described, and the acquis communautaire, the big body of EU law that you have to absorb and implement, this is not easy. It requires a lot of transition and transformation, and it does take time. My feeling is that the next mandate of the European Parliament after these elections and of the next European Commission is going to have to do an awful lot of Europe's preparation to absorb and Europe's pre-accession funding and preparation of the candidate states. And if that is done well for the next 5 years, it could be possible that in the subsequent 5 years, some of the early movers could be good to go. Now, others may have different views, and others may feel, well, you've got to throw the rules out the door and do it differently. But I think sat around the EU Council, the European Council table, you have some who'd like to hit the accelerator, you have others who'd like to hit the brake, and I think between them, they're going to have to find an operating coherent consensus. And I think great progress can be made in the coming years, but we shouldn't create false expectations. And on the other side, we shouldn't create a sense that this is mission impossible. We've done what might have appeared impossible before, and so we can do it again.
Thank you very much. And I know that we have been having this conversation for quite long, but there is just one last question. I need you to answer before I let you go. Because, we have to reflect on the upcoming European elections. I assume that as a former president of the European Parliament, probably the EP has a special place in your heart. I'm really curious to know whether you believe that the 9th of June is going to bring along any any fundamental change in the system of European politics. Like, we have long been hearing about the potential breakthrough of the far right, the weakening of the so-called mainstream parties, of the grand coalition of the socialists, the EPP, Renew, and the Greens. So I'm really curious about, without of course asking for any precise prediction of what's going to happen, I'm really curious about your idea about the general movements of European politics, whether they are going to be fundamental or we are going to practically preserve the status quo in a slightly different way.
I think the next European Parliament election, we always say in elections, this is the most important election, and people do it at home and people do it in Europe. I actually think this time it's true. I think the next European Parliament election, the next US presidential election, are perhaps the most consequential elections for some decades, because they are beginning to touch precisely on the question of what does Europe mean to us, and what are the values we're determined to maintain, promote, and defend, and how do we project our common interests in a multipolar world. And I expect, looking at all the opinion polls, that those parties of the right, of the hard right and the populist right, and of the right of the European People's Party in the Parliament will grow in number. The Identity and Democracy Group and the European Conservative and Reform Group will grow in numbers. I think as the election approaches, that the numbers that they grow by will be significant, but less than the predictions that were being made earlier this calendar year. I think that the largest group will be still the European People's Party, and it will emerge broadly similar in numbers, maybe a bit up, maybe a bit down, but not significantly up or down. I think that the Socialists and Democrats, the S&D group, may lose some seats, but less dramatic than some of the more colourful predictions again earlier this year. I regret, given just that I was associated with it, not with Renew Group, but with the group that is the foundational group, essentially European Liberals, that the Renew Group looks like it will be a significant loser of votes. And also the Greens and European Free Alliance, the Greens EFA group, will be a significant loser. Here's my expectation. Of course, I have to allow this is guesswork, an educated guess. I think if I add up the EPP, the SND, Renew, and the Greens, that they will still collectively constitute a majority of votes in the Parliament. But they will be a significantly reduced majority. They might be collectively of the order of 60% of the votes, but let's wait and see. They could still constitute what I could call potentially a hardcore, classically European centrist capacity to support a classic European, broadly centrist, bit left, bit right, bit liberal, bit green kind of program. The test of this, of course, and this is the time worth watching then, the Parliament will reconstitute itself, it will elect a new president and vice presidents, and it will then proceed to hear the nominee candidate for Commission presidency, which, all the expectations are, of course, that this will be the outgoing president, Ursula von der Leyen. She will need to view this panorama in front of her in the Parliament as a place where she needs to find workable majorities for the kind of program she will wish to introduce for the coming 5 years. And I suspect she will be fishing for votes across that panorama, particularly with the 4 groups I mentioned, and most likely also at least with elements of the ECR group. And so the chemistry of consent or dissent across that spectrum is something we don't yet know. The more that she might appear to rely on groups to the right of the EPP, the more it might cause groups to the left of the EPP to be wary about committing some of their votes or support. So I think there's going to be a very interesting, powerful period of bargaining and mutual understanding, which I can delineate today but can't precisely predict. But I think it's safe to assume that the groups I described to the left of the EPP, Renew, Greens, S&D and others, would not be happy to see a significant shift in any fundamental way to the right of the EPP. So what those margins of manoeuvre will be, we'll have to see. Ursula von der Leyen won a majority the last time, a slim majority, but she was then able to govern as a president of the Commission with considerable skill and capacity. So she will need to find enough votes across all that spectrum to win a majority. And then the real trick is to building a program that generates sufficient probable support. Probably it will be a 5-year period of rolling negotiation and rolling coalition building. And then, of course, it comes, a last comment I would make on the emergence of the potentially stronger right, is the right has these two large components, the ID part and the ECR part. It would appear, but I mean, it's not for me to make any presumption, that Mr. Orban is considering to position Fidesz potentially as part of the ECR group with Prime Minister Meloni from Italy, and currently that includes Mr. Kaczynski's Law and Justice Party. So, I mean, I ask myself, when I see Law and Justice fearful of Russia, supportive of Ukraine, and hugely transatlanticist in a traditional transatlanticist sense, and I see Fidesz and Mr. Orban closer than any other European leader to Mr. Putin, willing to, you know, slow things down sometimes in Ukraine, and really forging a new Mar-a-Lago alliance, which could be, you know, a different thing to classic transatlanticism. You have to wonder about the intellectual and policy coherence of some of the populist parties of the further right, who can appeal to national electoral bases, but who don't necessarily appeal on the same nationalist or patriotic nationalist triggers between one space and another. And so the strength of any group in the parliament isn't only a function of its number, but is powerfully a function of its coherence. And coherence is a strength that perhaps may be more elusive for some of these parties on the far right than is the case for the traditional pro-European parties of the centre.
Pat Cox, thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for your insights. I think it has been an absolute pleasure, not only for me, but also for our audience to listen to you and to your takes on the current situation of Europe and Hungary in it. So thank you again for joining us. And I really hope that in the very near future, we will have the chance to meet again, probably in person in Budapest.
Well, look, I look forward to that, and I deeply appreciate this opportunity to speak through you to whatever audience of Hungarians you've got. I hope that my clear and strong opinions do not offend. They're not designed to offend, but we owe each other honesty if we want to build proper dialogue together. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And bye-bye.
Goodbye.